Every white worker who died building the Transcontinental Railroad is named in the Central Pacific's company records. The Chinese workers are counted in aggregate when they are counted at all. I went looking for the names, and what I found was not a list. It was a gap, a documentary gap the size of a mountain, running through the middle of the most celebrated engineering achievement in 19th century America, and the gap is the story. Between 1865 and 1869, approximately 12,000 Chinese men built the western half of the first Transcontinental Railroad. They drilled 1,659 feet of tunnel through solid granite at 7,042 feet of elevation in the Sierra Nevada. They did this with 8-pound sledgehammers, steel chisels, black powder, and beginning in February 1867, liquid nitroglycerin that had never before been used in railroad construction in the United States. They worked by candlelight. They advanced 8 inches per day through a rock that broke their drill bits every few minutes. They lived through a winter that buried their camps under 40 feet of snow and killed entire work crews in avalanches whose victims were not recovered until the spring thaw revealed the bodies. They struck for better pay and shorter hours, and the company cut off their food supply until they went back into the mountain. They were paid less than the white workers. They bought their own food. They were excluded from the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869. The famous photograph shows no Chinese faces, and the company that employed them, that could not have built the railroad without them, did not keep records of how many of them died. The death toll estimate ranges from 500 to 2,000, depending on the source and the method of estimation. Nobody will ever know the exact number because the Central Pacific Railroad did not record the deaths of Chinese workers the way it recorded the deaths of white workers. A white foreman who was killed in a blasting accident appears in the company records by name with the date of death and the circumstances. A Chinese laborer who was killed in the same blast appears as part of a number, if he appears at all. The phrase that originated from this work has passed into the American language. Not a Chinaman's chance. It meant the odds are zero. The phrase came from the mountain, and the mountain earned it. The Summit Tunnel, designated Tunnel Number 6, was the longest and highest of 15 tunnels that the Central Pacific Railroad bored through the Sierra Nevada between 1865 and 1868. It ran 1,659 feet through a mass of solid granite at Donner Summit, at an elevation of approximately 7,042 feet above sea level. When it was completed, it was the highest railroad tunnel in the world. The granite inside the mountain was among the hardest stone on the North American continent, dense enough and crystalline enough that it shattered drill bits within minutes of contact and refused to yield to black powder at any rate faster than inches per day. The challenge of the Sierra Nevada was the challenge that nearly broke the Central Pacific. The railroad's chief engineer, Theodore Judah, had surveyed the route and identified Donner Pass as the most feasible crossing, but feasible was a relative term. The mountains rose from the Sacramento Valley floor to over 7,000 feet in elevation. The railroad's maximum permissible grade was 2.5%, which meant that the track could rise no more than 132 feet per mile. Achieving that grade through a granite mountain range required tunnels, 13 of them on the main line, plus retaining walls, cuts, fills, and bridges across ravines and rivers, all of it carved from stone in a landscape that had nearly killed the Donner Party 20 years earlier, and that received, in the winter of 1866 to 1867, 44 separate storms. The Central Pacific's construction superintendent was James Strobridge, a hard, profane, one-eyed Irishman who had lost his right eye in a blasting accident and who drove his crews with a relentlessness that the workers described in terms that did not flatter him. Charles Crocker, one of the railroad's 4 principal owners, known as the Big Four, alongside Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins, was responsible for construction. Crocker had a problem. He could not find workers. White laborers signed on for free transportation to the construction camps and then abandoned the railroad for the silver mines of the Comstock within a week. 9 out of 10 white workers hired in Sacramento never completed their first month. The work was brutal, the terrain was lethal, and the mines paid better. Crocker needed men who would stay. In January 1865, Crocker hired 50 Chinese workers on a trial basis over Strobridge's loud objections. Strobridge did not believe the Chinese were physically strong enough for the work. He was wrong. The Chinese workers were organized, disciplined, and efficient. They formed their own work gangs of approximately 20 men, chose their own headmen, cooked their own food, drank boiled tea instead of the river water that gave white workers dysentery, and worked with a precision and a consistency that the rotating, unreliable white workforce had never achieved. Within months, Crocker was recruiting Chinese workers by the thousands, first from the played-out gold mining camps of California, and then directly from the Guangdong province of southern China. By 1867, Chinese workers constituted roughly 80 to 90% of the Central Pacific's labor force. 12,000 men. They were paid between $26 and $35 per month, depending on the source and the period. White workers received $35 per month plus board. The Chinese received no board. They purchased their own food through Chinese merchants who accompanied the construction camps, buying dried fish, rice, dried oysters, seaweed, pork, poultry, and vegetables, and cooking their meals in the evenings in their own camps, which were separate from the white workers' camps. The company saved the cost of feeding 12,000 men by paying them less and making them feed themselves. The math was the same math that appears in every story on this channel. If your family came from Guangdong province, if your ancestors worked the gold fields of California and then moved to the railroad, if there is a family history that includes the words railroad and Sierra and tunnel and nobody wrote down what happened, subscribe if you want to see what I find next. The work on the Summit Tunnel began in the summer of 1866. The granite was so hard that conventional drilling methods produced almost no progress. A 3-man crew worked in rotation. One man held a steel chisel against the rock face. The other 2 swung 8-pound sledgehammers, alternating blows, striking the chisel with enough force to chip the granite. After each blow, the man holding the chisel rotated it a quarter turn. Blow, turn, blow, turn, by candlelight, in a space 9 feet high and narrow enough that the men could touch both walls. The air was thick with granite dust that coated the lungs and the candles and the skin and the clothing of every man in the heading. When the drill hole reached a depth of approximately 2 feet, the crew packed it with black powder, ran a fuse, retreated around a bend in the tunnel, and lit the fuse. The explosion loosened a few cubic feet of rock. The men went back in, loaded the debris into wheelbarrows and hand-pulled ore carts, hauled it out of the tunnel, dumped it over the side of the mountain, and started the next hole. The rate of advance was 8 to 14 inches per day. That is not a misprint. In 24 hours of continuous work, 3 rotating shifts of crews, the tunnel moved forward less than 1.5 feet. At that rate, the 1,659-foot tunnel would take years to complete, and the Central Pacific was in a race against the Union Pacific, which was building westward across the flat plains of Nebraska and Wyoming at a rate of miles per day. The mountain was losing the race. In August 1866, Crocker ordered a vertical shaft sunk from the top of the mountain to the level of the planned tunnel, 75 feet below the summit. The shaft was drilled by hand, the same way the tunnel was drilled, and the rock was hauled to the surface by bucket, first with a hand winch, and later with a small steam engine housed in a building designed to survive the snow. When the shaft reached tunnel level, crews began boring outward in both directions, east and west, from the bottom of the shaft. The tunnel now had 4 working headings instead of 2. 4 faces of granite were being attacked simultaneously. The tunnel advanced from both ends and from both sides of the central shaft, converging toward the middle. In February 1867, the Central Pacific began using nitroglycerin. This was the first use of nitroglycerin in railroad construction in the United States. The liquid explosive was manufactured on site by a chemist, following methods that Alfred Nobel had recently developed in Europe, but that had not yet been standardized or widely adopted in America. Nitroglycerin was roughly 10 times more powerful than black powder. It shattered the granite in ways that black powder could not. The rate of advance increased from 8 inches to 22 inches per day. The difference was the difference between finishing the tunnel in time to meet the Union Pacific and not finishing it at all. The nitroglycerin was also catastrophically unstable. A sharp impact could detonate it. A temperature change could detonate it. A drop could detonate it. The men who handled it, who poured it into drill holes by candlelight at the face of a granite tunnel 7,000 feet above sea level, understood that the substance in the container they were holding could kill them and everyone within the blast radius in a fraction of a second. Premature detonations killed workers throughout the construction period. The ASCE Engineering Landmark Report notes that only one worker is documented as dying from nitroglycerin during the summit tunnel specifically, but the broader Sierra construction across all 15 tunnels produced an undocumented number of nitroglycerin deaths, undocumented because the dead were Chinese and the company did not record their names. Then winter came. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was one of the worst in the recorded history of the Sierra Nevada. 44 storms crossed the mountains between November and April. Individual storms dropped 6 feet or more of snow in a single event. The accumulation at Donner Summit reached 40 feet. Some accounts say 60 feet. The construction camps were buried. The roads were impassable. Supply trains could not reach the tunnel entrances. The Chinese workers did what they had been doing since they arrived. They adapted. They dug tunnels through the snow, not through the granite, through the snow. They excavated corridors and chambers beneath the surface, connecting their living quarters to the tunnel entrances, to the cookhouses, to the supply dumps. They lived underground for months, working the granite tunnel from below the snowpack, in a world lit by candles and lanterns, where the only sky they saw was the ceiling of a snow cave, and the only sound was the hammer on the chisel and the chisel on the granite and the distant rumble of the storms above them. The avalanches came without warning. The slopes above the tunnel entrances and the construction camps were steep, loaded with fresh snow from every storm, and when the snow released, it came down the mountain at velocities no man could outrun. Entire work crews were swept off the mountain. Men were buried under tons of snow and rock and broken timber. Some were found alive. Most were not. The bodies of those killed in avalanches were not always recovered during the winter. The snow was too deep. The terrain was too dangerous. The company could not send crews to dig for corpses when the living crews were needed in the tunnel. The spring thaw revealed corpses. That sentence appears in the historical accounts of the Sierra construction, and it says, everything the company records do not. When the snow melted in the spring of 1867, the bodies of the men killed during the winter appeared on the slopes and in the ravines where the avalanches had carried them. They had been there for months. Some were found still holding their tools. Some were found in groups, indicating that the avalanche had taken an entire crew at once. The company did not record how many. The bodies were Chinese. The records were kept by white men, and the white men recorded what they considered worth recording. On June 24th, 1867, while the tunnel work was at its most intense, the Chinese workers went on strike. It was a remarkable act. Approximately 3,000 men, representing the vast majority of the workforce on the Sierra section, laid down their tools simultaneously in a strike that was, by all accounts, nonviolent and highly organized. Their demands were specific. They wanted $40 per month, up from $35. They wanted a 10-hour workday in the open air and an 8-hour workday inside the tunnels where the air was worse and the danger was higher. They wanted the right not to be whipped. They wanted the right to leave the railroad if they chose, without being forcibly prevented from doing so. Crocker's response was immediate. He cut off the food supply. The Chinese merchants who provisioned the camps were dependent on the railroad for transportation, and Crocker ordered them to stop delivering food. The workers had no other source of supply. They were at 7,000 feet of elevation in a mountain range, miles from any town, with no way to obtain food except through the company. After 8 days, the strike ended. The workers returned to the tunnel without any of their demands being met. Crocker later reduced the hours in the tunnels, but whether this was a concession or an independent decision is unclear. The company's official position was that the strike had been instigated by agents of the Union Pacific, a claim for which no evidence has ever been found. The summit tunnel was holed through on August 30th, 1867. The four headings met in the middle of the mountain with an alignment precision that the engineers who surveyed it described as remarkable. The tunnel was enlarged to its final dimensions. The track was laid, and on June 18, 1868, the first locomotive passed through Summit Tunnel number 6. The Central Pacific continued east across the Nevada desert toward the meeting point with the Union Pacific. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the Golden Spike was driven and the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. The famous photograph of the ceremony, one of the most reproduced images in American history, shows two locomotives facing each other, their cowcatchers almost touching, surrounded by dozens of men in suits and work clothes, railroad executives, military officers, Irish workers from the Union Pacific, track layers and engineers. There are no Chinese faces in the photograph. 12,000. Chinese men had built the western half of the railroad. They had drilled through 1,659 feet of solid granite. They had lived in snow tunnels for months. They had been buried in avalanches and blown apart by nitroglycerin and worked by candlelight and struck for their rights and been starved back to work. And when the ceremony was held to celebrate the completion of the project they had built, they were not in the picture. I keep coming back to that photograph. Not because of what is in it, because of what is not in it. The gap in the photograph is the same gap that runs through the company records. The men are missing from both. The company recorded the names of the white workers who died and did not record the names of the Chinese workers who died, and then held a ceremony to celebrate the completion of the project and did not include the Chinese workers in the celebration. The erasure was consistent. It was not an oversight. It was a practice. It was the way the system operated, the way every system on this channel has operated, which is to consume the labor and discard the laborer and record the tonnage and the profit and the equipment and not record the names of the men who produced them. The Summit Tunnel was designated a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Civil Engineers. In December 2024, the Federal Secretary of the Interior designated Summit Camp as a National Historic Landmark, the highest federal recognition of a site's historical significance. The tunnels at Donner Pass were used by trains for 125 years until 1993, when the line was rerouted through a new tunnel running through Mount Judah. The original Summit Tunnel sits abandoned now, open at both ends, accessible to hikers who walk through it in the summer and feel the temperature drop as they enter the granite bore and see how, on the walls, the marks of the drill holes that the three-man crews, made by candlelight, one blow at a time, 8 inches per day, through rock that broke their tools every few minutes. The drill marks are still visible. The granite holds them the way a bone holds the marks of a surgeon's tool. Each hole is roughly 2.5 inches wide and 2 feet deep, drilled by a man holding a chisel, while 2 other men swung hammers in alternating blows, turning the chisel a quarter turn after every strike, in air thick with granite dust, by the light of a candle stuck to the wall with tallow. The marks are everywhere. They cover the walls and the ceiling. Thousands of holes, each one representing hours of labor by a 3-man crew, each one packed with powder and blown, each one advancing the tunnel another inch, another 2 inches, another 8 inches toward the other side. The drill marks are the only physical record of the men who made them. The company did not write down their names. The granite did. Connie Young Yu, a historian and descendant of Chinese railroad workers, has said that the railroad Chinese story is the great American story of Chinese America. Gordon Chang, a Stanford professor who led the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, a multi-year research effort to recover the history of the Chinese workers, has said that the lack of documentation was not accidental. The company's failure to record Chinese deaths reflected the broader erasure of Chinese contributions from American history, an erasure that persisted through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and well into the 20th century. In 2014, the Department of Labor inducted the Chinese railroad workers into the Hall of Honor, recognizing them collectively because their individual names cannot be recovered. The recognition came 145 years after the Golden Spike ceremony from which they were excluded. I started with a gap, a documentary gap between two sets of records, the white workers named, the Chinese workers numbered, the same company, the same railroad, the same mountain, the same tunnel, the same drill, the same powder, the same rock, the same risk, the same death. Different records. 12,000 men built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. They drilled 1,659 feet through solid granite at 7,042 feet of elevation by candlelight, with 8-pound hammers and steel chisels that broke every few minutes, advancing 8 inches per day, living in snow tunnels through a winter of 44 storms, surviving avalanches that carried entire crews off the mountain, handling nitroglycerin that could detonate from a sharp impact, striking for wages and hours and the right not to be whipped, and being starved back to work by a company that cut off their food supply rather than meet a single demand. Somewhere between 500 and 2,000 of them died. Nobody recorded their names. The spring thaw revealed the bodies. The company recorded the tonnage. The photograph recorded the ceremony. And the men who built the tunnel were not in the photograph and were not in the records and were not in the ceremony. And the drill marks they left in the granite are the only proof they were there at all. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces under 40-ton weights. And sometimes, inside a granite mountain in the Sierra Nevada, 7,000 feet above sea level, men worked by candlelight with a hammer and a chisel, advancing 8 inches per day. These were men whose names the company did not write down, whose faces are not in the photograph, and whose bodies were found in the spring when the snow melted. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different, or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how America moved 28 million tons of iron ore across the Great Lakes and lost ships every winter doing it, that video is on screen now.